Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Cinzia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. So, whilst we lovers of ancient history love our Greek tragedies, there's one tragedy that most of us struggle to come to terms with: the lost texts of the ancient world. You know, the plays, poems, histories, stories, and myths that we'll never read. And sometimes we're aware of what we've lost due to references and intertextual allusions to them by the surviving writings. But in most cases, we will never know what we're missing. Hundreds, if not thousands, of poems, poets, playwrights, plays, stories, and historical documents of the ancient world are now no more than particles, fragments of dust blown out to sea or buried beneath cityscapes, leaving us with thousands of years long cliffhangers, which will never be resolved. And what's more frustrating is that not only everything we've lost is down to time, as many would like to point out, the burning of the Library of Alexandria is one of many examples how we've lost a lot of original text. There are actually more contemporary cases, with precarious ancient texts being lost due to carelessness of handlers, or torn out from pages, or spilt ink on them, or misplacement of the copies. And one of the most controversial ideas is that many of the works, such as the works of Sappho, were censored and destroyed by the Christian Church. But were they? Well, I recently actually received a video request from a follower called Claire. Hello, Claire, who used my Google form in the description box below. And she wrote, I'd love to see a video about how some of the lost texts of the ancient Greece happened. Sappho especially, but also the ones like the Cypria. Also, thank you for doing these videos. They revived my old love of ancient myths and finally gave me the motivation to start reading some of the original texts. I just finished the Iliad and 2 different translations of the Odyssey, which I ended up really enjoying, so thank you. Well, Claire, you're so welcome, and thank you for the lovely messages. You see, okay, we will cover the text that you mentioned in this video, along with a couple of other examples of lost tragedies and other plays, such as part of the epic cycle, and of course also the poetry. As I just mentioned, I have a little video request box down below, and if you're not following me over on Instagram or over here on my main channel, you will know that I'm actually launching a podcast. I specialise primarily on this channel about ancient history, but there will be a podcast section about very specific dark elements of history and literature. As you will see, my channel has changed its display name, so we have our new little podcast logo that will be coming on Spotify and Apple, etc. once it's all done. And I've invested a lot into new filming equipment that will, be effective for a podcast setup, which is longer hours, talking, multiple mics, etc. And also, if this isn't a demonstration of how much I've invested in this darn thing, then yes, this little bad boy will be my future filming setup, along with podcast equipment, etc. So, do I know how to use any of it? Absolutely not. No idea. Absolutely. I'm learning about the way, but that's the problem of being a solo artist with your own team. You have to learn all the skills yourself, from audio equipment to mixers. And the first episode will be on the history of the devil, which is most requested. But of course, I'll be covering loads of things from, anything haunting, fairy tales, folk tales, all the dark mysteries, even a couple of murder houses, whatever you fancy. It will be about dark history and dark literature. So if you're interested, you can use the same form down below to request that. And you can specify in the form if it will be for the podcast or for a general ancient history video. But before we get into the rest of today's video, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Now, as you know, I've built all of my main website and business websites over the past few years with Squarespace, and I'm working on my current one for the podcast / all this related stuff on there. And you can sign up to my email list down below if you're interested in finding out more. I love Squarespace because of how intuitive and easy it makes website design and layout. And, I know nothing about coding, which has made using other website platforms incredibly frustrating, to say the least. But with Squarespace, I can simply drag and drop my content where I want it. And if you're a creator like me, who's expanding their revenue stream, as I am, then Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy for you to monetize your content and expertise in a way that fits your brand. So Squarespace member area lets you sell courses or classes to your followers. Squarespace also has an inbuilt email campaign option where you can collect email subscribers and convert them into loyal customers or from your website. And the built-in analytics feature gives you insight into who's visiting your site, traffic sources, time spent on site, most read content, audience geography, and so much more. So if you want to expand your business or just build a beautiful website for your blogging leisure, then go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So, I'm obviously going to talk about the whole controversy of potentially the Catholic Church destroying all of Sappho's work and almost debunking a lot of these ideas as well. But let's start with the lost dramas, because there's a lot to cover. If you've ever read our version of Euripides' plays The Bacchae, then you'll know that at least 50 crucial lines of the play are actually missing because, and we don't really know, a page in an early copy on which all later copies were then depended upon must have got lost, ripped out, or irreparably damaged. Now you're probably wondering, primarily, wait, if it's missing entirely, then how do we know how many lines are missing? And that's a good question. Well, thankfully, because the lines were lost later in history rather than ancient, other ancient authors referenced and even quoted some of the missing lines from the end of the play, making it quite easy for later historians to piece things together. The evidence for the lost portions of the ending includes a few remarks and quotations from authors, including the 3rd century CE rhetorician Avicenna's 12th century Byzantine play about the Passion of Christ, which was once attributed to Gregory the Great, and some scraps of papyrus codex from Antonoi of the 5th century CE. And it's actually from calculating the number of missing lines per page in the codex that E.R. Dodds concluded that the missing portion of the text would be at least 50 lines long. We're actually quite fortunate when it comes to the Bacchae with that loss, because although there was a loss, the loss was quite late, and translators have worked very hard on trying to fill in the gaps at the ending as closely as possible. However, when it comes to the Greek tragedies, well, that's a tragedy in of itself. Out of all the tragedies produced in the 5th century BCE, we have 6 or 7 plays by Aeschylus, out of anything between 70 and 80 plays by him over a 30-year period. And I say between 6 and 7 because Prometheus Bound may not have been by Aeschylus but by his son Euphorion. But at least we have 6 of his plays for certain, which is more than can be said for most ancient Greek tragedians in the 5th and 4th century BCE. Phrynichus, Agathon, Neophron, Diogenes, Ion, Critias, Astyotimus, Chaeremon, and Theodectes are just a few of the Greek tragedians whose works we've lost entirely. And these writers weren't nobodies, they were prominent figures in their time. They were selected to compete in major festivals and often won prizes, such as Xenocles, which actually is the name of 2 Greek tragedians, a grandfather and his grandson. In 415 BCE, Xenocles actually gained the first prize for one of his trilogies in competition with Euripides himself. But funny enough, Xenocles wasn't the most popular amongst the other tragedians. I mean, for example, Aristophanes called elder Xenocles an execrable poet and constantly ridiculed him, and potentially even parodied Xenocles the Elder in his own play, The Clouds. Now, I know what you're thinking if you hear all this. Yes, the ancients were petty bitches just as much as people are online today. And whilst we don't have these tragedians' works, they were still famous enough in their time to be subject to jokes and parodies in contemporary comedy, considered important figures in contemporary cultural life, and had their plays quoted, discussed, or adapted by other writers. And the petty jokes made at their expense of writers such as Xenocles, Sthenelus, Morsimus, and Dionysius didn't mean that they were actually bad writers, as the other ancients like to say that they were. It was all in a popularity contest, they're featuring petty bullying and tearing each other down, a bit like how comedians do it today, and a bit of cliquey behaviour in between. So yes, not much different from today. And when it came to the comedies, writers rarely approved of other writers in their work, so it's kind of, part of the game. And the loss of these tragedians' plays is not indicative of the quality of their work. For example, Astyotimus. In 340 BCE, Astyotimus was the first ever tragedian to be honoured by the Athenians with a bronze portrait statue in the theatre of Dionysus. And the statue base, with part of the poet's name visible, can still be seen there today. Now, this honour is significant considering such statues were previously only used to commemorate politicians, successful generals, athletes, and other public benefactors. Astydamus is how I pronounce it. I've heard people say this very differently, this name. I've heard it say Astydimus, I've heard it say Astydamus. It could be, I say Astydamus, but it may not be pronounced that way, so, apologies. But again, I've looked online, everyone says it very differently, so I'm saying Astydamus. Now, Astydamus was the first tragedian to be memorialised in this way, and he was done this way before Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, who all also received statues of their own, but a decade or more later. Astydamus, or Astydamus, whichever one you prefer, was also the name of two poets, and they were actually father and son, but it was the son who was the more successful of the two, and he, the younger, was said to have written 240 tragedies and won 15 victories. And we have none of his work. Absolutely nothing survived. And we'll never know those magnificent plays that earned him the first ever statue honouring a tragedian in Athens. Gone forever. Some people would argue that Astydamus or Astydamus was somewhat of a creative revolutionary. The 2nd century CE lexicographer Pausanias recorded how Astydamus composed an epigram in which he expressed an ambition to be taken seriously alongside the, I'm going to use the word lightly, canonical writers, something which the Athenians judged to be too vainglorious to be inscribed on the base of the statue. It was apparently read to have said, "If only I had been born among them, or they had lived in our time, those poets who were thought to bear the first prize with their speech, then I could have been judged on a true basis, starting level with my competitors, but it is a run ahead, taking the lead given by time and no envy attaches to them." So Matthew Wright explains how these verses have been interpreted as a genuine attempt on Astydamus's part to challenge the canon, but the authenticity has been doubted. And it would seem more likely to me that the epigram and accompanying anecdote were invented later in the tradition to recast Astydamus in the role of a latecomer or challenger. But why was this recasting thought to be necessary? And how was it that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides came to be seen as the only tragedians worth taking seriously, even in ancient Greece? Well, let's start with pointing out the obvious. We never had an official canon in ancient authors until the rise of Christianity, but ancient audiences saw the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides as something akin to classics today, and they were frequently discussed, quoted, parodied, and even evoked in pictorial art. Then, in the late 4th century, the official selection and the commemoration of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides as a state tragedians of Athens cemented this status. You see, the decision was monumental in the formation of a literary canon which we now know today and how we regard classical playwrights. You see, during the 1330s and 1320s, the theatre of Dionysos was greatly expanded and rebuilt. It was around this time that Kyrgyz decreed that the bronze statue of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides should be erected in Athens, and that copies of these tragedies should be written out and preserved for state archives, that the city clerk should collate copies and use them for actors, and that it should be forbidden to perform versions that did not conform to these versions of the text. Now, Lycurgus was the son of Lycophron, who was an eminent Athenian statesman who held various positions of power between circa 337 to 324 BCE, including control of the state treasury and the oversight of the theatre. So, Lycurgus's decree arguably influenced how Athenians viewed and used their cultural heritage. Though unlikely to have been single-handedly responsible for the change, Lycurgus oversaw the formal establishment of the triad of a quasi-canonical group, as well as the institutionalization of tragedy as a unique cultural possession and the source of education for the Athenian state. And it's bonkers, really, when you think about it, that a single decision by one man thousands of years ago to form this literary triad was an event of a cataclysmic importance in terms of subsequent literary history that we still use today. From this time onwards, an enormous amount of prestige and cultural status became attached to the triad, and much less attention was given to the work of other playwrights, and most authors writing in that period wrote of Greek tragedies as if there were only these three. As Matthew Wright points out, it cannot be emphasized strongly enough that modern views of tragedy are the product of historically contingent process. The classic tragic triad may reflect the cultural currents in the Lycurgan Athens, or the preoccupations of later classical scholarship. Still, it is not an objective marker of the greatness, of the importance, and it is far from being an accurate reflection of the whole tragic genre or audience's taste in the classical period. Lost tragedies can serve as a focal point for discussions about cultural memory, canon formation, and the Greeks' preservation of their literary heritage. In this respect, the history of transmitting tragic texts from the classical period to the modern age raises important and not entirely unanswerable questions. The process seems to have involved a degree of deliberate selection, along with a large element of accident and mystery. When it comes to looking at lost poetry, there are two avenues. We have the lost parts of the epic cycle and epic poetry as a whole, and the poets whose works we've lost entirely or we only have fragments of. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm going to keep it down to two topics. We're going to look at the epic cycle, and we're going to look at Sappho and the controversy around potentially the Catholic or Christian church burning her works. So let's start with the epic cycle, which is so huge that Martin West's study of the lost Trojan epic spans well over half a century of research. And that's just the research on the Trojan epics. This research does not cover the Theban saga or cycle or the fragments of other epic poems, such as the Heraclea of Parnassus or of the Theseus. But anyway, so the Odyssey and the Iliad, you see, are just two poems within a larger Trojan cycle which stretches long before and after the Trojan War. Such poems include episodes ranging from Zeus's Malthusian decision to cause the war in Troy and Thebes, which was to relieve Earth of excessive human population in Cypria, the world's first known prequel, to the death of Odysseus, as recounted in the Telegony. So if you're interested in hearing about the stories about the missing epic cycles, then please let me know in the comments down below, and I will do a video detailing all of what we know, which was contained within each of these epic cycles. But for now, I'll just give you a rundown of the basics. So we have the Titanomachy, of which we have now 8 fragments, but there would be more. We have the Oedipea by Cunathan, which would probably consisted of 11 books, but of now we only have 3 fragments. The Thebaius, which was attributed to Homer and believed to consist of around 12 books, of which we only have 7 to 8 fragments. The Cypria, which was the pre-war epic that had 11 books and of which we have 22 fragments. The Aethiopis, which picks up where the Iliad left off with the Amazon Queen's arrival, and we have 3 fragments of this, and it would have had at least 5 books. Then we have the Little Iliad, which I like the name of, which detailed the death of Ajax the Great at Paris, and the famed Trojan Horse episode, of which we have 14 fragments. Then there was the Sack of Ilium, which you may have guessed, was about the sacking of Troy and consisted of 2 books, and we have 10 fragments of it. And the Nostoi, aka the Returns, which was the first post-war epic, which consisted of 5 books, and we have around 6 to 7 fragments of it. And then finally, we would have had the Telegony, which was a 2-book poem detailing the death of Odysseus, and of which we have 3 fragments. Again, we know of these poems primarily through the writers, such as the 2nd century CE writer Proclus, and a short summary of the Trojan cycle by an anonymous author, who is often called Apollodorus, in a book called The Library. Additionally, the sack of Troy was summarised by Roman poet Virgil in the 2nd book of the Aeneid, and the rest we owe to references of the epic cycle by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in their plays. And then we have the Theban cycle, which is the same ancient epic text, but they're their own little cycle in of themselves as well. So repeating, but also they have their own little cycle within the cycle. It's fun. So with the Theban cycle just isolating themselves from the Trojan epic, we have the Oedipodia, which is attributed to Canathon, which is the story of Oedipus's solution to the Sphinx's riddle. Then we had the Thebaid, of uncertain authorship, but as I said, it's often attributed to Homer, which was the story of the war between Oedipus and his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and of Polynices' unsuccessful expedition against the city of Thebes with 6 other commanders, which is known as the Seven Against Thebes, which, spoiler alert, both Eteocles and Polynices were killed. Then we have the Epigoinoi, attributed in antiquity to either Atimachos of Teos or Homer. And that's a continuation of the Thebaid, which told the story of the next generation of heroes who attacked Thebes, this time successfully. And then finally, we have the Alcmaeonis, of unknown authorship, which is a story of Alcmaeon, of course, Alcmaeon's murder of his mother, Eryphile, of having arranged the death of his father, which is also a story told in the Thebaid. And again, we have the Theban plays to thank for our knowledge of the context of these myths. And that was a lot of information, and it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what we've lost. You see, Aristotle in his Poetics criticizes, quote, all those poets who have composed a Heraclius, a Theseus, and poems of that kind, for their mistaken assumption that the career of a single hero gives unity to mythical narrative. But you're probably wondering, what are those? What are the Heraclius and the Theseus? Well, there are another 2 epics that we've lost. We have just 2 citations from the epic called the Thesiod, with no author being known or identified. And then we have Panyasis' Heraclea, which is an extensive work of some 9,000 lines divided into 14 books, the longest pre-Alexandria epics after the Iliad, Odyssey, and Antimachus' Thebaid. Historians have had to rely on Apollodorus' narrative as a guide in ordering the fragments that we have of it, but there's very little truly reliable evidence out there. And additionally, Panyasis is said to have composed an elegiac poem of 7,000 lines on the legendary colonization of Ionia, but there's no actual trace of this poem's currency or influence in antiquity, and there's actually a lot of doubt as to whether it ever even existed, and it's just kind of a rumour. So that takes us on to Sappho and Sappho's poetry and the truth about it. So Sappho of Lesbos, who lived circa 630 to 570 BCE, was the most praised and highly regarded of the Greek lyric poets in antiquity. She was known as the 10th Muse by Plato, and some ancient authors regarded her work as on par with that of Homer. Out of all 9 volumes of poetry that she wrote, the only complete poem we have of hers is the Ode to Aphrodite. The 9-volume edition of all of her works was compiled and published in the 3rd century BCE by Greek scholars working at the Great Library of Alexandria. Quelle surprise! Centuries after her death, and now we have no more than 700 fragment lines from her. And why is that? Well, this is where controversy comes in. You see, a lot of people blame Christian censorship. Christian censorship is a conspiratorial reason people love to recite when regarding the disappearance of Sappho's poetry. They claim that her poetry was so sexually explicit and openly gay that the church was too horrified to allow it to exist. Now, this theory seems to stem primarily from the French scholar Joseph Justus Scaliger, who claimed that Pope Gregory VII ordered all her poetry to be incinerated in around 1073 CE. But this is all just a theory. When it comes to the Roman poet Marcus Valerius Martialis, 38 to 104 CE, mainly known as Martial by most of us today, he was incredibly sexually explicit. Martial's references all kinds of sex acts, including lesbian sex, pegging, gay anal sex, heterosexual anal sex, fellatio, and many other specific sex acts that are a million times more explicit than anything ever found in anything by Sappho. Yet the church made it sure to preserve all 12 volumes of his works. Additionally, judging from the surviving poems and fragments of Sappho, Sappho's work was actually never that explicit, sexually. The most sexually explicit surviving passage occurs in fragment 94, which is sometimes known as Sappho's Confession, in which she seems to very obliquely allude to herself as having had sex with another woman. We get everything from her. The word lesbian comes from Lesbos, which is where she lived, and we get the word sapphic from her name, Sappho. And Sappho was actually a popular character in Athenian comedies in the late 5th and 4th centuries BCE. And although none of the plays featuring her character have survived, the information that has survived about the plays suggests that these plays depicted her as passionately desiring various men rather than women, which is interesting. And additionally, the Roman Empire from the late 5th century BCE through late antiquity were probably way more familiar with the legend of Sappho and Phaon, which tells us of how Sappho fell so madly in love with a young, extraordinarily beautiful ferryman named Phaon, who abandoned Sappho and disrespected her, that she killed herself by jumping off a cliff. And this is all to say that it's not that there's downright denial of her homoeroticism and that all of this was a cover-up. But it's to say that actually her homoeroticism was probably one of the least interesting elements to her by early Roman Christians and thereafter. And yes, some Christians absolutely despised her, mainly regarding that she was sexually unchaste. But not everyone saw Sappho this way, interestingly enough. I mean, if you look at Martial being sexually explicit and then people saying, well, it's probably that she was a lesbian that they cared more about, the church cared more about it than her sexual explicitness. Again, we don't have any proof of this. There's not a single ancient source that records anyone gathering up or collections of Sappho's poetry to be burned. The earliest reference of the idea of people burning her poetry comes from the Italian Renaissance scholar Pietro Alciono, who lived circa 1487 to 1527. My dog's playing with a toy, and he won't stop, so I'm going to let him carry on. So he claimed that the Byzantine emperor ordered Sappho's poems to be burned because of their frank treatment of sexual subjects. Again, nothing to do with her sexuality. This is just the sexual nature of it. And then later, the Italian Renaissance scholar Girolamo Cardano, who lived around 1501 to 1576, also claimed, without any evidence, that the Eastern Church Father Gregorios Nazianzenos, who lived around circa 329 to 390 CE, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople, had openly ordered Sappho's writings to be burned because, again, they were too explicitly sexual. But again, he made this claim many centuries later, and he had no evidence for it. And then, as I already mentioned, we had the French scholar Joseph Justus Scaliger, who lived 1540 to 1609, who claimed that Pope Gregory VII, who lived 1015 to 1085, had ordered all of Sappho's writings to be burned in the year 1073. But again, Scaliger claimed this without any evidence, and none of these Renaissance men claimed that they were burned due to the lesbian and gay nature of the books, but that they were entirely alleged to be too sexually explicit, which doesn't make sense considering the sexually explicit nature of Martial's poetry, which the church protected. So, why have we not got Sappho's work then? The more boring reason why we've lost Sappho's poetry is probably that Sappho wrote exclusively in Aeolic dialect of the Greek language, which contains numerous archaisms, spellings, punctuations, and innovations totally absent from any other dialects of the Greek language. The Aeolic dialect gradually died out over a course of the 3rd and the 1st centuries BCE, meaning many found her poetry too difficult to read and understand. Lyric poetry also became pretty unpopular during the time, meaning that lyric poets were copied less, meaning there were fewer copies available. And in late antiquity and early Middle Ages, people switched from writing on papyrus scrolls to writing on parchment codices, meaning texts written on papyrus scrolls that were not copied on parchment codices were lost. And with the poems becoming even more difficult to read with the Aeolic dialect to people in the early Middle Ages, it was very likely that most people just didn't want to bother copying them over, and they couldn't read them. They didn't understand them, so why copy them? So thus, by the 12th century, just purely down to popularity and ease of reading and researching and just the codexes and changing over the writing, that by the 12th century, Sappho's poetry had basically been almost completely lost. Just people like what they like and will choose to copy what they copy, and it's not as dramatic as a lot of people claim because we have no evidence. And the people who claimed that they were burnt did so without any evidence centuries after the apparent banning. But yes, that is it for today's video. I hope you found it interesting. Again, this was just a skimming of the top. I just thought I'd collect a load of things in together. Again, you can request any video requests or podcast requests in my little wee box down below. There's like a Google form. You can take that in. And a special thank you to my patrons who are popping on the screen here, and particularly my top tier patrons who are Robbie Groves, Arch Capitalist, Jeffrey Starburn, Andrea Bazil, and Nicholas Reed. Thank you so much for being such loyal patrons, supporters. And I hope you're really excited for the podcast, because I am. I'm still learning about all my kit that I've got. You know, I've got bloody little wee podcast mixy thing and a screen. I've got a screen so I can try and not edit the video, but control it from a distance from the camera. Because again, I'm a one-person band. I do the editing, I do the scripting, I do the researching, I do the writing, I do the blah, I do everything. So to control my own sound equipment from a distance, etc. So hopefully it'll pay off. You know? And yes, that's everything. Thank you so much, everyone, for supporting my channel. And again, resources down below. If you're interested in any of the books that I mentioned, I've listed them down below. And I'll pop links as well, which will be affiliate links if applicable. And you can use them if you want. You don't have to use them at all. But thank you so much again for watching my video and supporting my channel. Please give it a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.